thank you all for being here. You know, this is an issue that I just thank everybody in the world who cares about it. And so you obviously have demonstrated you care about it, and even if we don't agree, the fact that you care about it is really pretty important to me. So tonight we're going to have some fun, I hope, just looking at some of the things that have been major successes on both energy and environment. Look at those successes and say, do they inform us a little bit about how to take on the carbon problem? And then third, maybe try to make some observations about how we solve really big problems together. I'm going to start a little closer to the ground though. And it's a story that I've experienced firsthand, but it comes from the World Wildlife Fund. This is the rhino. It's the second largest land mammal in the world. This happens to be a white rhino from Africa. The rhino is so compelling. When you see it, it weighs about 4,000 pounds, maybe 5,000 in the big guys. So this is not a small dude. He's out there to make a difference. And the problem with the rhino is its horn is worth more than its weight in gold. So it's kind of like this animal is running around on the plains of Africa with a gold bullion on its head, and it's just too tempting for poachers. So the poachers go after it, kill the rhino, take the horn, sell the horn. And it's been a big problem, and really the people who have addressed it, both governments and NGOs, have tried lots of things. And there are two kinds of white rhinos, and so they give us a chance to look at the comparison of what works and what doesn't. The northern white rhino, which you see here, doesn't look that much different. They're really cousins, they're related, it's a subspecies. In the northern white rhino case, everyone decided, let's just stop poaching, ban any killing, any hunting, and put boots on the ground to try to enforce it. We'll call that ban enforcement, or maybe the Republicans will call it regulation. In this case, they were right. It didn't work very well, sadly. We saw the animals decline over time. Maybe it was because of wars, maybe it was because of government that wasn't very effective. I don't know, but regardless, today, we have 6 animals remaining. 3 of them are under guard, as you see here in this picture. In Kenya, 3 are in zoos. 2 weeks ago, it was 7. As far as we can tell, none of them will be able to reproduce. We'd still hope, but it looks like extinction. So it's not a very uplifting way to start this talk, except for the fact that there's a southern white rhino. And a southern white rhino, the story is very different. The people in South Africa primarily, but in Namibia and other countries in the south, said, well, we've got to do something to create a value for this animal more when it's alive than when it's dead. So let's try to find a way to get a market for the animal as a live animal versus a dead animal. And so they tried some things, starting with a controversial trophy hunts. You know, most of you probably don't think hunting a wild animal like this is a very good idea. But they felt that if they could make enough of a premium and people were not willing to pay enough, that it probably could protect the others. And in fact, it's worked out that way. They also changed the ownership laws so that private ranchers could own and breed rhinos, so that built the population. And finally, they created a sale and auction process, which was sort of a competition to the black market. And the happy news is there's now 20,000. A population we thought was extinct at the beginning of the last century, in fact, even 50 years ago, now has 20,000 animals and growing. They're still poaching, but the population is growing. So why do I bring this up? Well, the only difference between what we did with the southern white rhino and the northern white rhino is market incentives. The only thing that's different about it is they did something creative to try to create a value for this animal as a live animal, and look at the difference it made. The reason I bring it up is because we're going to be talking about market incentives tonight in dealing with the carbon problem, and I think this is a good way to start. Another experience, another personal experience, is the '73 energy crisis. And I can't see very well, but how many of you remember those gasoline lines? A lot of you. It was a scary time. You know, OPEC, particularly the Arab nations of OPEC, cut off our supply. And we, for the first time, really couldn't count on our oil supply. And we had these long lines, and we had prices going up, and we were really in a state of fright. And the president at that time was Richard Nixon, a Republican, who cared a lot about what we did, and he created something called Project Independence at the time. And in order to respond to it, he created something called the Federal Energy Administration. And for the first time in our history, he created a little office called the Energy Conservation and Environment Office. And he picked a not very well-known Stanford professor who knew nothing about energy to head up the office, and that would be me. Vicki, how could you marry somebody like that? I remember at the time thinking, well, geez, I hardly know the difference between a BTU and a kilowatt hour. How am I going to possibly do this job? And yet I really thought it was an interesting problem to solve, and so I boned up and got confirmed, and after being confirmed, sat at my desk with the same concerns. Well, now what do we do? You know, how do you conserve energy? And I remember all of the people that were in the office sort of had the same question. We didn't know how to do this, so we thought, well, let's try some stuff. And one of the first things we tried was cutting the speed limit from 70 to 55. Those of you who are around can thank me later. We had all sorts of scientific evidence that 28% of our gasoline would be saved if we could do this. Well, we kind of forgot about incentives, and no one had the incentive to either slow down, and those who did slow down were pretty angry about it. And pretty soon we had to drop it. It was one of our failures. We had several, but this is a good example of it. The next thing we tried was a little more effective. We said, geez, the mileage of these cars, these American cars, is really awful. It really is lousy compared to the Europeans or the Japanese. We were getting about 13.5 miles per gallon in 1974 of the new car fleet. So we called in the auto guys and said, well, geez, you guys could do better than that, couldn't you? And they said, no. You know, Americans want these big cars. And so happily we went to the Congress and said, you know, we would prefer to have a gasoline tax, but we know you're not going to pass that. We'd rather have a market incentive for people to use more efficient cars, but absent that, could you just give us legislative authority to change the mileage standard to 27 miles per gallon, double it over about the next 6 years? Well, they did. And look what happened. You know, by 1983, the new car fleet was 27 miles per gallon. And it made a huge difference. You'll see later, the oil price started to reflect that progress. But the bad news is, for the next 30 years, we did nothing. And I don't know whether we just lost our nerve or whether we didn't see what a great opportunity that was. Clearly, the capacity was there to make the improvement, but we didn't do it. The good news is that because there was a great Supreme Court case called EPA versus Massachusetts, the Supreme Court gave the EPA the right to regulate CO2 in automobiles initially and then across the board later. And so EPA put out new auto efficiency standards, fuel economy standards, going to 55 miles per gallon in the year 2025. Well, that'll make a huge difference in carbon emissions, and I'm really excited that we finally kind of got our way back again. Just as an aside, it's probably the only reason that went through is because the government owned the auto companies. Thanks to the financial crisis, the government was a stockholder at that point. Well, that's one thing that sort of worked really well in the beginning, not so well in the middle, and now hopefully will make a difference. The third was we thought, well, people really will behave better if they have information. So we can't ask people to do anything if they don't know what the efficiency is of appliances. So let's put a label. It'll be a voluntary thing. We won't try to require anything, but the label will tell people what the relative efficiency is of a refrigerator or a washer or another appliance. The happy news there is that worked pretty well. People started buying more efficient appliances. The appliance manufacturers started making more efficient appliances, and you'll see that label on any appliance that you go out to buy today. It's lasted the 40 years. Well, I mentioned that we tried a gasoline tax. That didn't work. In fact, my boss was John Sawhill at the time, a wonderful guy, and he was fired that afternoon for even proposing it. So it didn't even get to the Congress. It didn't even get through the Ford administration. Okay, what does that tell us about carbon? Well, first, some background on carbon. It's controversial. People don't agree about what carbon pollution is causing at this point, but I guess the only thing we could agree on is more carbon isn't good. Most of us would agree that the more carbon we put in the atmosphere, it's likely to create a greater risk. The background, most of you have seen these numbers. For 400,000 years, we've been going between 200 parts per million of carbon dioxide and 300 parts per million. And when it's down in the 200 range, we have ice ages, and when it's up in the 300, we had pretty warm periods, like we're going through right now. And so that's 400,000 years. We, of course, go back further than that, but humans didn't show up until about 200,000 years ago. So Homo sapiens come on the planet about halfway through that chart. And so you can see that the period of human existence is about half of that period, 200 to 300 parts per million. Fast forward to the last 1,000 years, and you see what's happened. It was pretty much at the top of that range for the first part of that millennium, and then we got the Industrial Revolution, and from that time on, that line's been going straight up. And currently, we're about 100 parts per million higher than humans have ever experienced before. It's, at the least, a really big experiment. At the worst, it's a catastrophe. So you sort of look at that slope of that line, and passing through 400 parts per million in 2012, when the scientists are telling us that in order to keep the planet to a 2 degrees Celsius warming, or about a 3.5 degree Fahrenheit warming, we've got to keep that number at about 450. Well, when you look at that slope, it's a tall order. We've got to turn that slope around and flatten it at 450 in order to keep the temperature rise. It's at least the scientific consensus. That's the challenge that we have ahead of us, and I guess that ought to be the context in which we have this discussion. Well, I've admitted that we don't know everything. Certainly the things that we hear in the papers, that people are not completely in agreement about this, there's certainly not a lot of understanding of what solutions are best at this point. We have a lot of technology out there. McKinsey has done some wonderful work in sort of arraying the cost of various ways of mitigating. So we know something about that, but we haven't tried very much. We also don't know what the best investments might be in that vein. We probably don't know how long it'll take, and we certainly don't know how much it'll cost. But again, the agreement seems to be around the fact that it'll be cheaper to do something now than it will be to defend against it later. The cost of mitigation is probably going to be much lower than the cost of building in walls and defenses. So that's where we stand at this point. We have a lot of things we don't know, and those things probably stop us. They probably put us in a position where we've been a bit frozen on the issue, unwilling to try things because we're kind of afraid of what we don't know. But it reminds me of the 70s and the energy crisis. We had some beliefs then that were similar. Energy is scarce was the principal context of everything that we talked about. Scarcity was, hi Louise, scarcity was one of those things that we just had to deal with, and we hadn't had to deal with it before, and so it was a bit daunting. We also thought that costs of energy, because of that scarcity, were just going to keep going up, and it was going to be a real economic hardship. And finally, more pertinent to my job, which was people thought you can't conserve and still have economic growth. Because if conservation has you going down, economic growth has you going up. They're in contradiction. It turns out all of those things were dead wrong. All of the assumptions we made at the time of the crisis, 40 years later, look like they were dead wrong. And let's go through some of the data. We thought in 1974 that we had reserves of oil of about 31 years. It's the blue line that you see there. 31 years of then consumption rate of oil available at that time. And we thought that line was going straight down. And look at what's happened. 40 years later, we have 51 years of reserves, and the consumption has grown by about 40% during that time. So scarcity really wasn't the issue at all. And whatever happened, maybe it was because OPEC raised the price so quickly that all of the incentives were to go out and find new oil or to conserve. But regardless, that's what's happened, and natural gas is a similar story. Prices. We thought they were going to just take off, and in fact they did. The first decade, you can see that they were rising pretty quickly, and then they stabilized. And you say, well, I'm not sure I understood that. I even was surprised when I looked at these data and I said, gee, that's nowhere near what I thought oil prices or gas prices had done during that time. And look at is that a mauve line, or what color is that? Somebody help me. It's a green, yellow. Anyway, that's electricity. Electricity, especially with all of the things that people were saying about pollution control, it's actually in a negative territory in real terms over 40 years. That's a pretty remarkable story. Clearly, these initial price rises that you see there caused a lot of action, and I want to make sure that we understand that OPEC was the one that gave us the financial incentive, even if we weren't willing to do a gasoline tax. And finally, conservation has been a remarkable achievement. We're using about half the energy per constant dollar of economic output as we were in 1974. Now that's an achievement, and one that I think we should be proud of, and clearly economic growth continued unabated, as you see in the right side. So all three of these things, which were kind of the principles on which we considered ourselves in an energy crisis, turned out not to be true. And in fact, I would say at this point, you can say we've literally solved the energy crisis of the 70s. So what happened? I sort of think it was just because we saw the fears and the doubt that came to all of us, motivated us to do something about it. Unlike what we're doing now with climate, it's kind of scaring us and keeping us from doing something. But in this case, it worked very well. We tried a lot of things. A lot of those things worked, and we should be very happy with the outcome. Here's another way of looking at it. The ice core here is the way we get our data. All of those data about the concentrations of carbon dioxide come from ice cores, which fortunately give us a pretty strong historic record. Here are some of the things that we're facing now about carbon. A lot of people think we can't afford to fix it. It's just going to be too costly, and therefore we better not try, because anything we do is going to cost so much that it'll ruin our economy. The other kind of concern is we really don't have the technology to fix it. It's, you know, people are not so sure that renewables, solar and wind and the others are going to really make the difference out there, as many people say. And then finally, which is probably the bulk of it, it's not our fault. It's either China and India are much bigger emitters than we are at this point, and they're really the problem, so it's not really us, it's the problem. Or mankind really hasn't caused this. This is a natural variation. So those are kind of the things, that's the place that we're at this point, and those are probably the biggest concerns that people have. I'm going to digress a little bit and just say, well, where is this starting to manifest itself? You've seen all of the data about ice sheets and glaciers. You know, I won't go into that, but here's a little island called Kiribati in the South Pacific, kind of due south of Honolulu. 100,000 people with a top elevation of 20 feet. So most of the people live below 20 feet, and because those glaciers are melting and because the ice sheets are caving off, and because water expands as it gets warmer, all of those things are causing ocean levels to rise. And so far, we've maybe had a foot or foot and a half, and it continues to look concerning that that's going to accelerate. But here's a little island that, whoa, find another power source. I do need another power source. I've always needed another power source. Anyway, this little island has a president who sort of understands where they're at. And he said not too long ago, it's kind of hard to think that we're at the point of no return when we'll no longer have a country. Clearly, all of us should be concerned that if an island like this gets flooded, that we lose a lot of biodiversity. But he's worried about his people. Where are they going to live? And if this was a one-off kind of concern, you'd say, well, you know, we'll figure it out. But it's probably 10,000 other islands that are like that. They're probably the shores of Florida, the shores of Bangladesh, are all kind of climate refugee problems that you see. But here's a leader of a country that's already trying to face up to the fact that he may not have a country in a few years. The other thing that we spent some time on, but don't as much as I think we should, is the number of record high temperatures in the United States has gone up steadily over the last 50 years to where the number of record highs now is about twice what it was in the 1960s. And the record lows are about half, as you would expect. That's not just causing discomfort, it's causing premature death. We're now experiencing more deaths from heat, from extreme heat, than we are from any other weather-related cause like tornadoes or hurricanes. Well, that just is a couple of the manifestations of what we're now experiencing. There we go. So why in the face of all of that can I maintain my optimism? I guess it's because, I grew up, I may be the oldest person in the room, but I grew up in the Depression. And that was a problem that we thought we'd never get out of. And then I went through World War II, and that was a problem we weren't sure we'd ever get out of. And then I was an intimate part of the energy crisis, and that was a problem we thought we'd never get out of. And it just sort of seems to me we've proven that problem solving is in our DNA. We sort of like to solve problems. I mean, in our company, AES, we used to call it fun to solve problems. We call fun solving problems because that's really where we got our kicks. We love to get in a room and say, this is really a tough one, and figure it out. It wasn't parties. Most people think of fun as parties, but I think of fun as problem solving. I think it's part of our DNA, and I think we've shown that in our history. Let me give you a couple examples. We had, in the company, we were trying to compete with utilities. We were a little company when we started, and we decided coal was the most cost-effective way to generate power to be competitive. And so we're building a coal-fired plant on the Thames River in Connecticut. When I came over here one day to a World Resources Institute board meeting, I was on the board of WRI, and I got this story about climate. It was 1987. And wow, this is daunting. This is not going to go away. And I came back to the company and said, well, we got to be part of the solution. We can't be part of the problem. And here we are building a coal plant, and that's just going to put more CO2 emissions. What should we do about it? And kind of went around the room, and one after another had some ideas. Finally, a woman named Cheryl Sturgis raised her hand, and she said, well, plant trees. I said, well, that's an interesting idea. How does that work? And she said, well, trees sequester carbon. If we plant enough trees, we can sequester all the carbon that we emit, and we'll be carbon neutral. And I said, well, that's a really good idea. How many trees? She said, well, I'll get back to you. She did. 52 million. I said, yikes, It's a good idea, except for the 52 million part. And I said, how much will that cost? And she said, well, it'll be about $2 million because CARE is doing this great project, and they're going to plant the trees anyway, and we can really make it happen with $2 million. And I said, our profits last year were $2 million. We were a pretty small company, but we did it. And there are the trees, some of them. They're still sequestering carbon. The plant's been shut down because it reached the end of its useful life, as one would expect. But there they are. The New Yorker lampooned us. But we're in the New Yorker. I mean, heck, what? Yeah. In all seriousness, no, I think it was the first carbon neutral coal plant in the world. And I wish. Now, a more serious problem that we had to solve. In 1970, we had the first time we really had looked at at air pollution. We had the, what was the 1970, we had the Earth Day. Earth Day, as I recall, and I just thought of that in 1970, was kind of a motivation to say, let's look at our air pollution. And it was pretty dirty. And it was not just for scenery, it was because of health reasons. And darn it, President Nixon didn't take the lead on that and push through the Clean Air Act. And he got 90% of both houses to support it, Republicans and Democrats, because everybody felt this was a problem we had to solve. One would say those were the good old days, but certainly That was an amazing, amazing thing. Well, look what happened. Those 4 pollutants on the left, particulates, sulfur dioxide, which is acid rain, carbon monoxide, volatile organic compounds, were the first 4 of those pollutants that we tried to regulate. Later on, we regulated NOx and the smaller particulates. By 1990, when George H.W. Bush was president, we'd already started to make incredible progress. And I remember at the time feeling like, gosh, this is really starting to look like a success. And then President Bush came in and said, well, let's make it even a greater success. By the way, another Republican president who said, let's not only add NOx and smaller particulates to this mix, but let's try some market incentives. Let's put in a price on sulfur dioxide so that if somebody, instead of putting in a scrubber, decides that they would like to buy an allowance from somebody who's done more than they had to do, we can have some trading going on. You call that cap and trade. It was a Republican idea, and it was President Bush who really did that in his campaign. Look what happened. By 2012, we've got a historic achievement on our hands. Here we are, 82% less sulfur dioxide than we had in absolute terms in 1970, and the other pollutants are just a little greater than that. I think this is an American triumph. No matter what party put it in, no matter who did it, it's something we ought to celebrate as one of the great achievements of all time. And just in 2008, I mentioned that the Supreme Court had a case called Massachusetts versus EPA, in which it added carbon dioxide to the mix. So the 7th priority pollutant is carbon dioxide. It's on the scale here at 1.2 because in 1970 it was at 1. We've added about 20% since that time to our emissions. But the Supreme Court, bless them, gave us a chance to say, well, let's try to control carbon dioxide. They didn't require EPA to do it, just said you can, and you can do it under the Clean Air Act. Well, that's really started a whole raft of activity, one of which is the Environmental Protection Agency putting out some proposed rules on existing power plants, which you might say, well, as a power plant operator, you probably don't like them at all. Contrary, I just think they're wonderful. I think they have done exactly what I'd hoped they'd do. They've tried to take into account all of the nuances of what states are using what fuel mix and give a different baseline. They've given all sorts of flexibility for state and local solutions all the way up to using a regulatory approach or using a market incentive sort of approach. They've given all sorts of collaborative opportunities for people to meet it. But the part I'm most happy with, it's finally showing some U.S. leadership, which I guess many of us have been waiting for a long time. But that's also just one part of what's going on. You see all of these other things. The mayors of the 40 largest cities around the globe under Mayor Bloomberg's leadership have committed to an 80% reduction in their carbon footprint by 2050. California has initiated a cap and trade program, which is just getting underway and showing a great deal of promise. RGGI is a program in the northeastern states that's similar to California. The clean energy tax credits, renewable portfolio standards, and I've already mentioned the fuel economy standards, which I think are a big part of this. But that's just the beginning. You see other things like individuals and corporations and people doing things on their own. I think things have changed to the point where what stops us may be saving us. It may be that our fears and doubts are starting to lead to some action. I love this picture because it's the Apollo 13 control room. And that's when they recovered those astronauts. If you saw that movie, you know exactly what I mean. If you didn't see it, go see it. It's a remarkable story of what could go wrong, did go wrong. And the tenacity of these people on the ground and in the capsule to try and fix this is just a triumph. And so it's kind of a metaphor for how we solve problems. And as I've looked at that, you sort of look at what they did, and sticking together and collaborating and working together was clearly an essential part of solving that problem. Clearly that's what happened with the Clean Air Act, and that's one of the reasons we had success. You can bring up many more examples. They tried lots of things, multiple solutions, and some of which were really cockamamie. You know, they were doing Rube Goldberg, putting cardboard pieces together to try to make something work, but they weren't afraid to fail. And sure enough, they weren't ever going to give up. And I think this is why I use this, is just because I think that's maybe something we keep in our minds about how we solve big problems together. And now, using that background to say, well, where does that leave us with regard to problems of carbon pollution? Government regulation is starting, both at the state and the federal level now. We have lots of individual actions. As I mentioned, the things that you do, like changing out your light bulbs from incandescent to maybe LEDs, or buying a Prius, or whatever you do. You see lots of that going on, and you see certainly a lot of corporate leadership coming. So there's a lot of individual actions on top of the things that I mentioned going on in states and localities. The thing that we're missing is market incentives. We don't have any way to reward somebody who develops a clean energy product or to penalize somebody who keeps emitting. And in order to really solve this problem, we've got to have that. Going back to the rhino, that's why I bring it up. This is a little case, really, but market incentives are what was essential to save the population of the southern white rhino. When you look at the energy crisis, the same thing is true. We had regulation, we had voluntary action, we should be proud of that, but the market incentives were really the things that really OPEC-inspired market incentives, what brought greater efficiency and increased reserves and even cleaner air. But when it comes to the climate crisis, we're still missing that ingredient, that market incentive. And as a result, we still have that line going straight up. So I come out that without a price on carbon, we're not going to have a solution. Without a way to provide the incentive for people to develop clean energy, without an incentive for people to stop emitting carbon, we're not going to get there. And for me, it's a carbon tax. Maybe for others, it'll be something different, but a price on carbon has to be there. Somehow that has to be recognized. And a carbon tax is attractive to me just because we could make it revenue neutral. We could easily collect the tax and then rebate the tax. So collect it on a bad and give it back on a good. So maybe lower the payroll tax, maybe lower even corporate taxes are a possibility. But regardless, I think we could make it revenue neutral. So it's not a deficit handling technique. It's just a way of putting a price on carbon. The other part that I'll mention is, and many of you here are the same way, as I kind of grew up believing in people. And I think was able to start a company that sort of had as our principal notion is we believe in people, that people were the reason that we could accomplish things. And you sort of look around the country and that's mostly true. People really do want to do the right thing, for the country, for their community, for their families. And when you put good incentives with them, you really get some remarkable solutions. And I think that's what we're trying to emphasize here that with creating a climate solution, we'll do a lot of the things that we've done before. We shouldn't think of it as being easy. We shouldn't think of it as something that is simple. It is going to take huge dedication for us to accomplish what we have to accomplish. But when you look at this final picture of the capsule, this is the actual recovery of the astronauts when they were recovered after the mission. It's an image that evokes how we solve problems together, by sticking together, by trying lots of things, by not being afraid to fail, and most of all, by not giving up. But it's another, it creates a metaphor for the planet as well. The people in that Apollo 13 team didn't try to save that capsule, they tried to save the astronauts. And we don't try to save the planet except to save our loved ones. There's lots of biodiversity and we care deeply about that, but I think that's a metaphor we should keep in our minds. If we can rescue those astronauts, and if we can restore the white rhino, and if we can solve the energy crisis, and if we can clean up our air, if we can do all of those things, surely we ought to be able to find a solution to the carbon problem together. I hope that what I can leave with you tonight is an idea of what that solution might look like. Clearly, it'll require some responsible regulation. It'll require some wise individual actions. But the transformation, the real transformation, will come from putting a price on carbon, from changing the incentives so that we accomplish. I don't think President Obama's commitment to China last week can be accomplished without a price on carbon. That reduction is not in the cards, just in a regulatory and voluntary action. And I'd hope you'd also take away that this is not something we haven't done before. We've done these things. We can build on the back of our successes with the Clean Air Act, our successes with the energy crisis, and hopefully together with a market incentive we can unleash the creative powers, the problem-solving instincts in all of us. Thanks very much.
Well done, darling.
Thank you so much, Roger. That was very enlightening. If I could call you back, because we would like to open up the floor for Q&A.
Okay.
So just when you thought you could breathe.
I'm just going to put my website.
But I want to say before you entertain Q&A that that you're speaking of the role of people and people being able to do things collectively together. I would be remiss if I didn't say Vicki Sant is really your person, because you do so much together and what the Summit Foundation does. So thank you. And Ambassador, we're very happy you could be with us as well. So Roger, take questions from the floor. Any questions? Right in the back.
My experience with the environmental community is that they want to get 100%. And there's a concept you can, 20% of the cost will get you rid of 80% of the problem. The last 20% costs 80%. Where are the compromises that the environmental community can give up? The little things they do that irritate non-environmentalists, that seem silly and don't have much payback. What are those?
Well, I think it starts with making everybody wrong. Making everybody wrong. I think my biggest concern with the way we behaved is we sort of made people bad guys if they're in the fossil fuel industry, and they're good guys if they're in renewables. And that's not likely to produce an outcome that's very favorable. I mean, I think we have lacked the inclusiveness that's going to be necessary to solve the problem. So I think one of the reasons I'm so interested in a carbon tax is because I think that'll give the incentive for the fossil fuel industry to even look at things like carbon capture that would make them part of the issue. But going further to your point, I think that's just the problem of politics in general, as we all want everything. And I think compromise has got to be part of the way we reach out in the environmental community, the way we all reach out to each other. But I don't know specifically what gives ups. I would, for instance, here's one I would do all day long, if I were in a position. Give up EPA regulation for a carbon tax. Give up the Keystone Pipeline for a carbon tax. I mean, I think we're probably at a point when we need to start making those kinds of trades. We need to put something that's attractive enough for the people who have been on the other side of this issue to find it in their self-interest to go forward. Yes, sir.
I mean, in your opinion, would the oil industry and the coal industry get together? Would they fight a carbon tax, or would they be supportive?
I have a really good friend who is the chairman of Shell, and I asked him exactly the same question. He said, well, Shell is absolutely clear. They advocate a $40 a ton carbon tax at this point. And then he just sent me another thing from Bloomberg today that said Exxon is in the same position. I think we're really seeing the oil industry recognizing in their internal decisions. I mean, my friend Chad Holliday said that in their decisions, and I think this is all public, so I'm not saying anything out of school, that all of their decisions internally, they hit it with a $40 a ton carbon tax. They said, that's probably going to be the world we're living in. So when we make our investment decisions, let's have that externality added on top of it. So I'm hopeful. I mean, I don't know that industry can lead anybody, but it'd be nice to have them not opposing, for sure. Yes, Bruce.
Thank you, Roger. You're an inspiration, that's the first thing. Second, what about the analogy between what we did, the United States, on energy on the one hand and climate on the other? The we is different, is it not? We're talking about the United States, the nation with energy and national security. National security. We're talking in climate about international security and global issues. And if we put ourselves in a carbon tax, which I happen to favor, how do we make ourselves less effective against our competitors?
Well, first of all, your point is so well taken. This is unlike any other environmental issue we face. It's a global, truly global issue. A ton of carbon, doesn't matter where it's emitted, is going to have the same effect on the planet. So it's a different kind of problem. The other reason it's different is it stays up there for 100,000 years. With SO2, we could afford to make a mistake. If we made a mistake, we could turn it around. In 10 years, we did. But this one is up there, so it makes it a little more serious a game. But I think the issue you raise could be handled with a border tax. If let's say we had a $30 a ton carbon tax, I know Erwin Stelzer's in this room and he studied this. I think we could do a border tax so that we could keep our competitiveness if we're standing alone. But I just feel like we have to lead. We're now not the top emitter in the world, but we're still in a position where we have to lead. And if we do, I do think that what we saw in China last week is just the beginning of other countries starting to come in and say, let's do it.
Can you elaborate on the border tax? I don't know how that
It just, Erwin, do you want to? Well, it just means that it'd be essentially an import tax. You would say if we're charging this kind of a carbon tax, since anyone importing someone with that content of carbon would get a similar kind of tariff. And, you know, we're all free traders, but until it gets close to home and then we change our mind. But in this case, I think it clearly could be done. Erwin, anything to add?
No, I mean, I've talked to a lot of lawyers about it, and they say, oh, I'm sorry. I've talked to a lot of lawyers about it, and you get two sets of opinions. My judgment is, when you read all the literature, that this would pass WTO scrutiny. We won't know till we do it, and if we threaten to do it, we may never have to do it. It's one of those weapons that we have available to say to China or India, that's fine, you don't want to do this, but your imports are going to get hit as they come in because we're not going to give up competitiveness, which is a very, very important piece if you're going to get conservative support for what they ought to support anyhow, which is a pricing mechanism, but they don't really, you got to drag them kicking and screaming to that conclusion.
But at least that's the idea. And certainly, Erwin is illustrating another thing, is whatever we do here, it's probably got to be a conservative idea. I mean, it's not going to be a Democrat that leads this effort. It's probably going to be a conservative that says, I much prefer a carbon tax than I do regulation. I much prefer to have less bureaucracy than more bureaucracy. I much prefer to tax something on consumption than I do on payroll or something good. So there are a lot of reasons for us to have some hopes that at some stage they become interested in this because it's more in keeping with kind of the doctrine of the Republican Party I used to belong to. Yes, sir.
Am I correct in understanding that you seem to have a preference for the carbon tax as opposed to cap and trade? And if so, could you explain why?
Yeah, for a long time I was really strongly in the cap and trade because it worked so well with SO2. And it was also because it was a Republican idea. And so I think a lot of us went with cap and trade because we thought, gosh, yeah, that's more of a market mechanism. Let's start with that rather than a straight regulatory approach. I think as time has gone on, I've become convinced that there's more gaming that could go on with a cap and trade program than with a straight carbon tax. I mean, with a carbon tax, we could make it pretty simple. You know, at the origin of the BTUs is where the tax would be applied, and you could make it pretty simple, and it would be pretty hard to game. Whereas the cap and trade bill that came out of the House really got complicated. You know, and it's not that they didn't do everything they could to try to make it not complicated, but it just became complicated. So that's why I'm sort of leaning towards a straight carbon tax. Yes.
I'm curious where you stand on nuclear energy and where you connect this into the...
It's got to be allowed. I mean, I'm not for banning it. I just have had too much experience to think it'll ever be competitive. But be my guest. You know, if you think you can build a nuclear plant and compete with solar, bless you. I don't think you can. But if you can, you ought to have a chance to play. I was saying to someone tonight, nuclear has always been a promise, and I just wish that it would become more than a promise. You know, it's always got cost overruns. It always takes longer to build, and it just turns out it's a really complicated way to boil water. You know, and that's all we're doing is making steam, you know, to run a turbine. And you say, well, I maybe be able to do it a little simpler, but I would love for those guys to be the solution. I'm a little worried about the back end, but the solution would have to include all of the things that we're worried about. But I sure think they ought to be allowed. Yes, sir.
Just, thank you. I think talking about the different success stories, one of the things that seems to me is pretty different in this situation is that it's been completely infused with politics, and that gets in the way of people coming together and being creative, coming up solutions. And I just wonder, it seems to me the reason that is because you have one particular one part of industrial part of the economy that is acutely affected by a carbon tax. And hence there's a constituency that's going to fight it tooth and nail because their ox is getting gored. And I just wonder, have you thought about whether there are ways to mitigate the negative impact of a carbon tax on energy producers such that they become a little bit like what the Obama administration did with the insurance companies with Obamacare, to co-opt them and make them a part of the solution instead of just being dug in and fighting?
Well, as I explained, I think that might have been true 10 years ago. I'm not so sure it's true now. I think you're absolutely right, it's been politicized. But I think that's a party problem, not necessarily an industry problem. I mean, I'm an industry guy, so I have to say I know a little bit about that. And it just seems to me we all were much more willing to say, yeah, this is an externality that we're going to have to face up to. And I think any good business person would say, I don't want to be a stranded asset. I want to understand that these things are likely to come. So I'm more concerned about depoliticizing it than I am the industry, because I don't think the industry at this point is the problem. I think corporate leadership is one of the things we got going in our favor. You got municipal leadership, you've got state leadership. We're just sort of missing the federal leadership. And again, I think that's got to come from a conservative origin in order for it to be successful. I think the utility industry, my industry, proved in the last round that they were really willing to be part of the solution. They were really part of the leadership in trying to get something done there, and it didn't work out. So, over here. Yes.
Hi, Roger. This is actually a follow-up to what you're just saying. So, and you made the remark about Shell being for a carbon tax. I think if you look at the power sector, you're going to find most people are going to say, give us a tax or cap and trade, and because right now we're dealing with a lot of uncertainty. So it's almost like we've got we have the corporate people behind it, but we don't have the politicians behind it. How do we change that?
And I read the polls right, we got the people behind it too. So what's wrong with this picture? I thought politics were about looking at polls. The polls are decidedly in favor of doing something. Maybe when it comes down to saying, well, you have to pay $1 more per gallon, it's not so apparent. But if they're getting a rebate at the same time, I think that's why I guess I'm optimistic, is I think those things are all sort of moving in our favor. And I think you summarized better than I that the utility industry, for instance, builds plants that last for 30 years. They need to have as much certainty when they're making that investment decision as possible. And similarly, even in the oil and gas industry, it's not that long, but they're making some pretty long-term bets. So I think the certainty would help them. But I need somebody to explain why our premise is not working out so far. Do you have an answer?
Yeah, I do. Just a quick one for you. I think you need a little bit better help from the marketing guys. And so what could we call this rather than a tax? Because that's the word that's going to hurt us in politics and with the people. So let's come up with a little clever way to call it something.
I'm guilty of, if it quacks like a duck and walks like a duck. I've heard that so much, and you're probably right, but it just bothers me. I don't think you get anywhere by trying to hide it. I think you call a tax and you take your lumps. But it obviously is a word that people don't like. But I nevertheless think it's probably better to be transparent.
One more question here.
One more.
Hi, thank you for that talk. I'm curious how much you think individual behavior change can make a difference, and if so, how people should sort through the information about, say, local food versus elsewhere, or, a vegetarian diet, how much they drive, things like that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's hard for consumers without an economic incentive to make good choices. So I'll start there. And I think it's one of the reasons I think we need to reflect the costs of this pollution in the prices that we pay. And so I wouldn't blame consumers quite as much as I would blame us for not making it pretty obvious what consumers should choose. I think we did a pretty good job on appliances by just saying, well, here's a good one and here's not so good one, choose a good one. And we even put out labels on cars to say what the miles per gallon, so you could see what your annual cost of fuel. And I think all of the things that give people information are good things, but it's pretty complicated. I mean, I've tried to get our house to LEED Platinum, and it's an old house, and I can't get there. I think a lot of us are motivated to want to do something. It's easy for me to go out and buy a Tesla, because I love the darn car. I mean, that was probably the easiest thing I've ever done. And that's amazing. I mean, you're getting about 95 miles a gallon on that thing. And so that's pretty easy. But just finding a way in our home to get to, quote, LEED Platinum was pretty hard. Fortunately, the buildings, commercial buildings are coming around, and we're working a lot in our foundation on sustainable cities. And we're really encouraged by what's going on there. So I think city leadership, state leadership will help the consumer a lot. But I know the problem. It's not easy, even when you're totally motivated, to do all the things that might be appropriate.